October 1943, Algiers, Allied Forces Headquarters. The war in the Mediterranean was supposed to be over by now. At least that is what the planners in London and Washington had told themselves when they drew up the timelines for Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily that summer. Take the island, open the sea lanes, knock Italy out of the war. Then turn everything north and west toward the thing that actually mattered, which was France and the road to Berlin. Sicily had been taken, the sea lanes had been opened. Italy had surrendered in September and then immediately complicated that surrender by becoming an active battlefield anyway, which was a particular kind of Allied problem that nobody had quite anticipated. But none of that was what was making October 1943 difficult for General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in the Mediterranean theater. What was making October 1943 difficult was that two of his senior commanders had just spent 6 weeks in Sicily competing so aggressively and so publicly against each other that the victory they had produced together was now generating more institutional friction than a defeat would have. And in 6 days, Eisenhower had to sit both of them down at the same dinner table. The two men in question were General George Patton, commanding the United States 7th Army, and General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 8th Army. They had fought alongside each other in the Sicilian campaign from July through August of 1943. They had won, and somehow the winning had made everything worse. To understand why, you need to understand what had actually happened in Sicily, because the official version and the operational reality were two significantly different things. The plan for Operation Husky assigned Montgomery's 8th Army the primary role. His forces would drive north along the eastern coast of Sicily, take the port city of Messina at the island's northeastern tip, and cut off the German and Italian forces from their escape route to mainland Italy. Patton's 7th Army was assigned to protect Montgomery's left flank. It was a supporting role, a secondary assignment, the kind of mission that gets a paragraph in the history books while the main effort gets the chapter. Patton had accepted the assignment without public complaint, which was itself a signal that anyone who knew him should have read carefully. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and most consequential acts of deliberate insubordination in the history of American arms. Patton did not guard Montgomery's flank. He drove northwest across Sicily at a speed that no operational planning had anticipated, seized Palermo, the island's capital and largest city, and then turned east along the northern coast toward Messina. He arrived at the gates of Messina on August 17th. His soldiers were already in the streets, already accepting the surrender of the city's garrison, already hanging American flags from the buildings when the first elements of Montgomery's 8th Army appeared at the outskirts later that same day. Montgomery had stood at those outskirts and looked at what Patton had done. He had said nothing audible to the record, but the officers standing near him watched his face, and they did not need him to say anything. The expression communicated everything. Montgomery understood precisely what had happened. Patton had taken the mission that Montgomery was supposed to win, and had won it first, in front of every journalist and photographer covering the campaign, in a manner that no amount of official framing could disguise. The British press tried. The American press went the other direction entirely. And Eisenhower, sitting in Algiers trying to hold a coalition together while simultaneously managing the invasion of mainland Italy, added the Patton and Montgomery problem to the long list of problems that came with being the one man responsible for making nations that had different histories, different military cultures, and different post-war ambitions fight as a single unified force. He had been trying to resolve the Patton and Montgomery problem through careful management and deliberate separation since August. He had kept them apart. He had channeled their communications through staff officers. He had used the natural geography of the Italian campaign, which had sent their forces in different directions, as a buffer between personalities that he knew were incompatible. In October, he decided that what the coalition needed was a formal dinner. Senior commanders together, a visible demonstration of Allied unity. Good food, French wine, white tablecloths, and the kind of orchestrated cordiality that Eisenhower had become expert at staging since North Africa. It was, in retrospect, an optimistic plan. The dinner was scheduled for the evening of October 14th at Allied Forces headquarters in Algiers. The guest list included the senior British and American commanders in the theater, their chiefs of staff, and a selection of senior Allied officers whose presence would signal the coalition's coherence to the correspondents who would inevitably hear about the event and report on it. Eisenhower arrived early, which was his habit at events like this. He used the time before guests arrived to read the room, to place officers strategically, to think through which conversations needed to be encouraged and which needed to be prevented. He was exceptionally good at this. He had been doing it since assuming command in North Africa in late 1942, and he had learned through repeated and occasionally painful experience that the work of holding an alliance together happened most critically in the hours before the formal meeting began. Montgomery arrived next. He came in service dress that was, by the standards of the British Army's uniform regulations, entirely correct. But correct was only the beginning of the statement Montgomery made with his appearance, and the rest of it ran directly against those same regulations in ways that Montgomery had long since decided he was senior enough to ignore. The black beret had become inseparable from his public identity. He wore it with the twin badges of the Royal Tank Regiment and his own general officer's insignia pinned to it, each badge representing a campaign, each one chosen and positioned deliberately. His jacket was pressed and correct, but beneath it, visible at the collar, was a ribbed sweater of the kind that infantry officers wore in the field, worn here in a formal dining room in Algiers as a statement that Bernard Montgomery did not adjust his appearance for the occasion adjusted for him. It was a performance as calculated in its way as anything Patton would walk in wearing. But where Patton's performance said authority, Montgomery's said something more specific. It said, "I am the professional. I am the man who is actually at war. The ceremony and the formality and the polished dining rooms are for other people." Patton arrived 40 minutes later. The room noticed him before he reached the door. The uniform Patton wore that evening was not the standard issue of the United States Army. It was custom-tailored, cut to his measurements by a tailor in London who had been given very specific instructions, and it fit him the way uniforms in paintings fit their subjects, which is to say, with a perfection that actual military clothing does not naturally achieve. The jacket was pressed to angles. The brass buttons caught the light from every direction. He wore Jodhpur riding pants and cavalry boots that his orderly spent 45 minutes on every morning, and the shine on those boots had become something that the enlisted men in his command discussed among themselves with a combination of admiration and genuine confusion about the physics involved. On each hip, in polished leather holsters, hung the revolvers, the ivory handles, the weapons that had been photographed in more newspapers than most generals' faces. They were not ceremonial. Patton had worn revolvers in combat in Mexico in 1916, in France in the First War, and in North Africa and Sicily in this one. He wore them now in a formal dining room in Algiers because they were part of the statement, and the statement was never optional. Across his chest ran more ribbons and decorations than most officers accumulated in a complete career. Patton had been at war in various forms since 1916. The ribbons were documentation. The whole construction was deliberate, down to the last detail. Patton had been building this appearance for 30 years. It was not vanity, or at least it was not only vanity. It was a language he spoke to his soldiers every day he stood among them. It said, "Look at the man in charge of your lives. Look at how seriously he takes this. Look at what he has decided you are worth." He walked into the dining room and the conversations shifted the way conversations always shifted when Patton entered any room. People noticed. They always noticed. Montgomery watched it happen from his seat near the center of the table. He waited until Patton was close enough that the officers on both sides of them could hear clearly. Then he said, in the tone of a man noting a minor administrative irregularity, "I say, George, you look like you are attending a fancy dress party." Fancy dress, a costume party, said in front of a table of generals and chiefs of staff from two nations, in front of their supreme Allied commander, in a room full of officers who would carry whatever happened next back to their respective headquarters and repeat it in every mess from London to Cairo. The table went quiet.
Patton stopped walking. The stillness came first. Everyone who was in that room and later described the moment mentioned the stillness before anything else. Not anger, not a flush of color, not a visible reaction of any kind. Just a man who had just been handed something and was deciding what to do with it. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Patton looked at Montgomery, looked specifically at the beret and the sweater and the carefully constructed informality of the man sitting there, and he said, at a volume that was not quite quiet and not quite loud, "And you look like you have come to fix the bloody plumbing." The sound that came from the table in the following second was a collection of things that several officers simultaneously tried to convert into coughs. Eisenhower, at the head of the table, did not move his expression 1 degree in any direction. Brigadier General Hobart Gay, Patton's chief of staff, seated 2 chairs down, watched Montgomery's face cycle through something that took a moment to fully resolve itself. Montgomery had set this up as a public diminishment, the relaxed British professional gently deflating American excess. He had expected Patton to redden and bristle and confirm the characterization by reacting to it with visible agitation. What he had not calculated was the speed of the return or the precision of it. The plumbing line was not just a joke, it was analytically accurate. Montgomery's presentation, removed from the context of the 8th Army's operational headquarters where it carried the weight of his reputation and his record, did read in a formal dining room in Algiers exactly the way Patton had just described it. Every officer at the table was privately and immediately conceding this. Montgomery held his expression for a moment. He understood he had not landed where he intended to land. Then he made the error. He looked at the revolvers, at the ivory handles and the polished holsters, and the full, elaborate production of Patton's appearance. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has decided to finish rather than walk away from. "Frankly, George," he said, "it looks rather like a circus." The word was chosen, and it landed differently than the first remark had. Patton set both hands flat on the table. Gay would tell colleagues in the weeks following that he had watched Patton's face do something in the moment after Montgomery said that word that he had not seen before and that he found genuinely difficult to describe afterward. It was not rage in the sense of a man losing control. It was the opposite of that. It was a man who had just received information and had gone very cold and very deliberate in response to it. The uniform was not a costume. That was the calculation Montgomery had gotten wrong. Men from the 2nd Armored Division, men from the 1st Infantry Division, men who had gone into Tunisia in November of 1942 without knowing what they were doing and had come out the other side in May of 1943 as soldiers who had beaten the Afrika Korps and knew it. Those men had looked up at officers wearing that uniform on the worst days of their military lives and had found something in it that helped them get through what was in front of them. The uniform was a promise.
It was Patton's daily declaration that the man responsible for their lives understood the weight of that responsibility and was not going to pretend otherwise by dressing like he was somewhere else. Montgomery had looked at that and said circus. "Monty," Patton said. His voice was level, not raised. The ceiling fans above the table were the loudest thing in the room. "I have been to war twice. I have been shot, shelled, and strafed by the enemy. I have commanded more men in more successful offensive operations in the past 18 months than your complete operational record prior to 1940. He did not lean forward. He did not raise his voice. He kept both hands flat on the table, and he looked at Montgomery without looking away. "You may dress as a gardener if it pleases you. That is your privilege as a field marshal of the British Empire. But if you make one more remark about my uniform, I will take those badges off your hat and I will make you eat them." The room did not breathe. Montgomery rose halfway out of his chair. What the witnesses disagreed on in subsequent accounts was precisely how far he rose. Some said he came fully to his feet. Some said he stopped himself somewhere in the middle. What no one who was in that room on the evening of October 14th disputed was the 4 seconds that followed. 4 seconds in which two of the most senior Allied commanders in the European and Mediterranean theaters stood within reach of each other, with every person at the table understanding that the next thing that happened could either be words or something that would appear in no official document and end both their careers before the year was out. Eisenhower spoke. He said one word. He said it at a volume that was intended for exactly 2 men and no one else in that room. He said, "Gentlemen." Nothing more, no elaboration, no constructed sentence, no diplomatic framing, just the one word from the Supreme Allied Commander, delivered with the precision of a man who understood that the next syllable out of his mouth would determine whether the situation resolved or accelerated, and who had chosen accordingly. Montgomery sat back down. Patton took his seat. The dinner continued. The food was served, and the courses moved through the table, and the conversations around the room resumed, with the particular quality of energy that fills a space where something almost happened, and everyone is compensating by being slightly more normal than normal. Eisenhower spoke with the officers on either side of him and gave no visible indication that the previous 5 minutes had occurred. Montgomery engaged the British commanders nearest to him. Patton ate with the appetite he always brought to meals and talked with the American officers around him with complete apparent ease. Gay watched Patton for the rest of that dinner and catalogued what the performance cost. The jaw that stayed a fraction too tight for a man who was genuinely relaxed. The right hand that moved toward his hip twice during the meal without completing whatever motion it had started. The way Patton looked down the length of the table at Montgomery 2 or 3 times during the later courses, not with anger exactly, but with the focused and patient attention of a man who is building a file. When the dinner ended and the officers dispersed into the Algerian night, Gay fell into step beside Patton on the way to the staff car and waited. Patton walked for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he said he backed down. Not triumphantly, not with satisfaction, as a statement of operational fact, the way he might note that a particular road junction had been secured. That was all he said about it that night. Gay understood that this was not because Patton considered the matter closed. It was because Patton considered the matter recorded. The incident had entered whatever internal accounting system Patton maintained for the people around him, and it would stay there. What Eisenhower said about the dinner afterward was nothing, not to his staff, not in his diary, not in any message to General George Marshall in Washington. This was deliberate. Eisenhower had learned in North Africa that the most dangerous things he could do with incidents involving Patton were to write them down and to discuss them with people who had not been present. Both actions turned manageable friction into institutional crises. He had nearly lost Patton over the slapping incident 2 months earlier, precisely because the incident had become a story before Eisenhower could contain it. He was not going to let a dinner table confrontation follow the same path. What Eisenhower did instead was think carefully about what October 14th had revealed, and what it had revealed was this. The chemistry between Patton and Montgomery had not improved since Sicily, it had hardened. The Messina episode had not faded with time the way Eisenhower had hoped it might. It had calcified into something that formal dinners and careful management were not going to dissolve. The two men were not going to find a way to like each other. The most that could be achieved was professional function, and professional function was going to require that they operate in separate theaters with separate objectives and as little direct interaction as possible. This conclusion would shape the command architecture of the Normandy invasion in ways that neither Patton nor Montgomery fully understood at the time. The planning for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of northwestern France that would begin in June of 1944, consumed the winter and spring that followed the Algiers dinner. The command decisions made during that planning period would determine how the war in Western Europe was fought and who would be remembered for winning it. Montgomery was appointed to command all Allied ground forces for the initial phase of the invasion. This was the announcement made in January of 1944, and it gave him operational authority over both British and American forces during the Normandy campaign. It was, by any measure, a significant confirmation of his standing in the coalition. Patton received nothing. The official explanation involved the slapping incident, which had created political problems in Washington that Eisenhower was still managing. The unofficial explanation, which circulated among senior officers in London and Algiers without ever reaching an official document, was that Patton's operational style was incompatible with the kind of set-piece, methodical, resource-intensive campaign that the Normandy invasion required in its early phases. He was too aggressive, too independent, too likely to ignore flank security in pursuit of objectives that were not on the approved plan. What the official explanation and the unofficial explanation both avoided saying directly was simpler than either of them. Patton and Montgomery could not be placed in the same command structure. Sicily had proven that. Algiers had underlined it. One of them had to be given the primary role, and one of them had to wait. The choice of which was which had been made, and Patton was the one waiting. Patton spent the first months of 1944 in England commanding a fictitious army group that existed only as a deception operation designed to convince German intelligence that the main Allied invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. He traveled. He gave speeches that were carefully leaked to German informants. He appeared at events in locations designed to be observed and reported. He commanded men who were not there against an invasion that was not happening, and he did it with the professional discipline of a man who understood what was being asked of him and why, and who had decided that patience was the price of eventual deployment. He received command of the 3rd United States Army on August 1, 1944, 56 days after the Normandy landings. By that point, Montgomery's ground forces command had been restructured. The Americans had broken out of the Normandy bocage in Operation Cobra, and the campaign had entered the kind of fluid, fast-moving mobile warfare that Patton had been training for since he first studied armored operations after the First World War. What followed over the next 9 months was the operational record that settled the argument that the dinner in Algiers had only opened. Third Army crossed France at a speed that German commanders later testified had disrupted every defensive plan they attempted to construct. Patton covered ground in weeks that strategic assessments had projected would take months. He turned his entire army 90 degrees in December of 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge and drove north to relieve Bastogne in a movement that military historians and staff college instructors are still analyzing. He crossed the Rhine River on March 22nd of 1945, while Montgomery's forces were still assembling the engineering and artillery infrastructure required for the set-piece crossing Montgomery had planned at Wesel, which launched the following day. Patton called General Omar Bradley from the far bank and gave him specific instructions. He said, "Tell the world we are across." He wanted it in the newspapers before Montgomery started his engines. Montgomery's crossing at Wesel on March 23rd was a masterpiece of planning. 300,000 Allied troops, massive artillery preparation, 2 airborne divisions, engineering units constructing bridges under fire. It was precisely the kind of overwhelming, methodical, resource-intensive operation that Montgomery had been executing successfully since El Alamein in 1942. It succeeded completely. It succeeded one day after Patton had already proven the river could be taken. The two men never had another dinner like Algiers. They communicated through staff officers and formal messages, and the occasional face-to-face meeting that both of them treated as an operational obligation rather than anything resembling professional engagement. Montgomery continued to advocate for broader command authority and continued to run into the structural reality that American forces outnumbered British forces in the theater by a ratio that made those arguments progressively more difficult to sustain. Patton continued to advance and continued to generate the kind of operational results that made the arguments about his command style progressively more difficult to make. The war ended in May of 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. The argument about which of them was the better commander did not end with it. It continued in memoirs and biographies and staff college debates for the following 80 years. Montgomery wrote about American commanders in terms that made his private opinions public in ways that confirmed everything his American colleagues had suspected about him. Patton did not live to write his full account. He died in December of 1945 from injuries sustained when his staff car was struck by an American military truck on a road outside Mannheim, 12 days before he would have returned to the United States. What the historical record shows clearly enough is this: Montgomery was a commander of genuine and significant ability. His operational planning was meticulous. His logistical preparation was thorough. The campaigns he designed were executed with a precision that saved lives by reducing the variables his soldiers faced. El Alamein, the Sicilian campaign on the eastern axis, the Rhine crossing at Wesel, these were professional achievements of a high order, and they belong in the record alongside the criticisms. But Montgomery's understanding of coalition warfare, of what it required from a senior commander in terms of managing relationships across national and institutional lines, was limited in ways that his tactical ability could not compensate for. He tried to fire an American general for asking questions in a planning meeting. He insulted a colleague's uniform in front of a room full of officers from both their nations. He claimed credit for outcomes that the operational record distributed more broadly than he acknowledged. He treated the management of allies as a problem to be solved on his terms rather than a responsibility to be shared. Patton was not an easier man. He was not a diplomat. He was not the kind of commander who made coalition management simpler. He was vain and he was volatile, and he made decisions that caused Eisenhower genuine institutional problems on multiple occasions. But when Patton walked into a room in that uniform, the men who had served under him understood what the uniform meant. They had been in the desert with him. They had been in Sicily with him. They had crossed France with him. They knew the difference between a performance and a promise. Montgomery called it a circus. Third Army covered 700 miles of European territory in 9 months, liberated hundreds of thousands of square miles, took hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and did it faster than any armored force in the history of modern warfare to that point. The circus, as it turned out, was the best show in the theater. and the man who built it made sure every single morning from the day he first put on a uniform to the last day he wore one that everyone who looked at him knew exactly what they were watching.